Hello everybody, welcome to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today's video is super exciting for me because this is another top 4 breakdown, but the difference between this and other top 4 breakdowns that I've done in the past is that I ended up winning this whole tournament. And I'll go into more details on how that happened when we get to my deck list, but it's super amazing to be sitting here so excited about a performance that I'm very, very proud of, and I can't wait to tell you guys more. Before we get into the video, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. So the event we are talking about today is Mox Masters 1, and Mox Masters is sponsored by the channel Playing with Power, the largest name in cEDH, and run by Eminence Gaming, the team that brought you Punt City and is bringing you many, many tournaments to come. We'll talk about them a little bit later in the show. But this is an online tournament, once again, sponsored by Playing with Power, run by Eminence Gaming. So just two powerhouses of the cEDH community putting on this tournament. Let's get into these decks. First deck from this top 4 is a Rograk and Silas ad nauseum deck. Now, this player who went by WTF, it's not butter. This is a classic Rog Silas turbo ad nauseum, very intense, quick turbo storm build. Now, this build in particular, I was going to say before I even did my research into this, it was very similar to the Epic Storm version. So Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm, famous legacy player who has been venturing into cEDH lately and playing in some groups that I'm aware of, has been really heavy on Rograk Silas, which makes a lot of sense for a Storm player from Legacy, but obviously very convinced that this is like one of the fastest and best decks in the format, and I, as people know who've been following the channel for a while, I'm a big Rog Silas fan. In fact, I actually hear a lot of people like very negative about probably one of the best decks in the format in like open spaces. A lot of people, I think, due to the fact that Rog Silas is kind of easy to play okay and not to its full potential, I think a lot of people tend to underrate this deck. But in general, I knew that this was based very heavily on the Epic Storm variant of this deck. So I went over to Bryant Cook's list, the Epic Storm list, and did a compare feature here on Moxfield, and they are literally a single card apart. Our WTF It's Not Butter player was playing Jessica's Will, whereas Bryant is now playing Last Chance, which is basically a sorcery speed version of Final Fortune. So for those who don't know, this is a turbo ad nauseum build, so you're trying to resolve an ad nauseum as quickly as possible. Rograk in the command zone is just super broken in the way that it allows you to have cards like Mox Amber just become a Mox Ruby from turn 1, Moonsnare Prototype, Paradise Mantle, Springleaf Drum. Basically are all these additional free mana rocks that you have access to in very easy ways to crack your piles and like have that turn 1, turn 2 ad nause. So Rog Silas's whole thing is like jamming super early in the game. There's some, interesting cards in here like Defense Grid, very good at stopping your opponent, stopping you, winning, things like that. As I mentioned, Brian's list is on Final Fortune and Last Chance, whereas this one is only on Last Chance. Definitely really committing. Oh, but this one's also on Warriors, though. So Brian's list is on 3 versions of this effect. The take an extra turn, you lose at the end of that turn. Whereas this list was choosing to play Jessica's Wills over that option, which I tend to agree with. I think that's probably the way to go. This deck being so aggressive that it is playing 4 separate wheel effects. Now, I'm also doing something kind of similar with my own Turbo Rograk build, but I really don't like Wheel of Misfortune, especially when you're kind of so heavy into the ad nauseum plan. So for me, I'm actually playing Whispering Madness instead, but that's definitely obviously just a choice of preference here. Apart from that, this deck is just trying to play the Grixis spells as quickly as possible because Rograk is kind of busted and allows you to do that. Then you're winning usually with a Thassa's Oracle, whether you're doing the whole classic Demonic Consultation, Tainted Pact thing, or whether you are milling your entire library and going off with LED and Underworld Breach to either mill your whole library and play Thoracle or just mill each opponent out. So that's the deck for you right now. Now I'm going to move on to the second deck from this top 4. This is Kraum Armix by Viaprano 8. This list is really interesting because it's playing more mid-range options than I think I'm used to seeing in Kraum Armix, and I really appreciated some of these inclusions. One of them specifically is 4-mana Teferi. I think that card gives you a ton of card advantage, and if your Kraum is being fed a lot, Teferi really helps to like control the board. That, and in combination with having Armix on the battlefield, if you have Armix being able to kill creatures while Teferi is also able to like phase out specific creatures at times, I think you can really have control over the board state in a deck that tends to be a little faster leaning, but also, you know, does better against stacks decks than a lot of other Grixis options. This is also a classic, you know, Thrasios Oracle, Tymna Consultation win con, as well as having cards like Underworld Breach in the list. Both of the decks we talked about playing Dress Down because it's one of the best anti-stacks pieces in the entire format. It like allows you to pull wins out of absolutely nowhere. There's some interesting includes in this list that I would not expect. Definitely some spicy pieces for sure. Imperial Recruiter being one of those pieces. I'm not used to seeing that in a list, and especially a list that tends to be more mid-rangey, but also your main targets are like Ragavan, Dockside, Ledger Shredder, Phantasmal Image, and Thrasios Oracle. And that's really the only targets in the deck. So that was very interesting to me to see this Imperial Recruiter play. I know people do it a lot in like Grixis Malcolm, but that's because you can grab like Glinthorn Buccaneer off of that. So I was very interested by that choice. You can't even really grab your Notion Thief, which is interesting. This list also mentioning that it's more mid-range. They have Narset and Notion Thief, which makes sense given the fact that they are on Time Twister, Windfall, and Wheel of Fortune. So not on 4 wheels like Rog Silas, but it's also hard for a deck that isn't Rog Silas to really have those same payoffs. Another clue that this is more of a mid-range deck is that they are playing Toxic Deluge, which definitely helps against the stacks matchups. Yawgmoth's Will, love to see that inclusion here. Some of the really spicy ones that I'm noticing. There's the inclusion of Trickbind, which is not a card people play almost at all. But when this card is good, it is really good. When it's bad, it is really bad. So it's kind of interesting. And I'm trying to remember, because at one point during the day of this tournament, I had my Tivit trigger Trickbinded, and I'm trying to remember if it was during this match or if it was a different match, and I also happened to run into a different Trickbind opponent, because as I mentioned, it's not a card you see a lot, so the fact that I potentially ran into 2 during the day is kind of wild. But yeah, there's cards like Dockside Extortionists, Enter the Battlefield Trigger, and Thrasios Oracle, and stuff like that, that it does have a lot of effect against, and the fact that it can't be countered is pretty cool. And yet, I've also played Stifle Effects in the past, and, you know, their limited scope has definitely been something to consider, and the fact that they only do so much. Intuition's also a very interesting include here because you aren't in white, which means that you don't get like the classic Savine's Reclamation piles that you normally would get with Intuition. So this is more of a value Intuition, and it wouldn't be one that I would normally include in a list like this because there's decks like Kess that also are Grixis piles with Intuition, but Kess allows you to like have this basically guaranteed Intuition pile, and there's also some Intuition piles with like Grixis Malcolm that allow you to like get a reanimate an Underworld Breach in your Glinthorn Buccaneer. Whereas this deck doesn't really have any guaranteed pile from what I'm seeing in the list, so I was kind of interested to see that inclusion. Apart from that, this is like a relatively standard Armix Kraum deck. The whole point of Armix Kraum is to like be the mid-rangier side of the Grixis decks. You're having a little bit more play into the stacks decks of the format, so the mid-range decks of the format, and it definitely provides you with more options. You can slow down the game a little bit if it's necessary for your angle, but you can also, you know, have turns where you go like free mana rock Dockside into Culling the Weak, and then like play your Adnaz on turn 2, right, or turn 1. So that is definitely an option, right? And it's very interesting to see this deck do well. I think it's obviously a solid deck. It hasn't really like performed in a little bit. I just think people had a little bit of hype for it and then they fell off it, which is kind of wild because it's positioned very well in the tournament meta for cEDH in general. So seeing this deck show up again was really cool. So yeah, congrats to Viprano8 on making the top 4 with this list. So here we have Goosey, also known as Gustav, the Goose Online. Someone who, if you've been watching my videos for any amount of time, this is a name you're quite familiar with. They have won a Playing with Power tournament before. They are a frequent player in the competitive scene. Gustav is someone who I knew very early on in his career and was very impressed by the level of his play and told him that I thought he had a lot of potential. And then he won, or he top 4 at a tournament, and I said, this is not the first top 4 from this man. And here we are with yet another top 4 under his belt. Gustav here is playing, and I believe this is this back-to-back top 4s with this deck for him because he also top 4'd the last Chaos event. But yeah, so this is Tymna Halana. It is a mid-range Protean Hulk deck. So you're kind of just doing the Tymna Halana thing, right? So Tymna is your card advantage. Halana is removal, which in our finals match and several other matches I watched with Gustav comes in very helpful, especially in the games that slow down a good amount. But it's also technically a Protean Hulk sacrifice outlet because when Protean Hulk enters the battlefield, you pay into Halana's ability and have Protean Hulk deal damage equal to its power to itself. so you can make Protean Hulk kill itself, which is kind of funny with the commander. Apart from that, there's a classic Mana Dork package. As you see with all these Protean Hulk decks, there's a lot of these like one drops, right? You have all your Mana Dorks, you have your Allosaurus Shepherd to keep your piles protected, you have your Esper Sentinel to give you card advantage, and you have your 2 1-mana sacrifice effects. Gustav going up to a third one of those at 2 mana, which I have found to be very helpful whenever I'm playing Protean Hulk strategies. Find the new card from, I think, Dominaria, Activated Sleeper. This card is very, very good. It is really, really good for Protean Hulk piles. It's probably one of the best things to happen to Protean Hulk piles in a while. It's just very good at like letting you multi-pile. For those who don't know, let's talk about Protean Hulk itself. Protean Hulk is a creature that says when it dies, you search your library for a number of creatures with total mana value 6 or less, and you put them onto the battlefield and shuffle. So the idea is you get Protean Hulk on the battlefield, you sacrifice it, and you assemble a pile that will win you the game. Now, when you're playing a list like this one, which is a little more mid-rangey, right, and you don't have Thassa's Oracle to make these really clean piles, you kind of sort of have these layered Hulk pile options, right? So you're playing cards like Activated Sleeper to get you a second pile. You get your sacrifice outlets. You get cards like Safi, Eric's Daughter, and Karmic Guides. So you can start infinitely recurring things out of the graveyard. LSL Core is our new Blood Artist effect. It's the new one from Dominaria, so it's just kind of an upgraded Blood Artist, so I totally get why it's being played here. And yeah, so that's the whole idea, right? It's like you get one of these piles going and sort of just infinitely sacrifice stuff over and over again. Body Launderer does something similar, as well as Body Snatcher. So Gustav's playing a lot of different ways to recur the Protean Hulk if he sacrifices it. Like there's a lot, like Body Launderer, Body Snatcher, Activated Sleeper, Karmic Guide, all different ways that you can grab your Hulk out of the graveyard while you're doing the whole Protean Hulk pile thing. So it's definitely interesting to see that, and there's a lot of redundancy to that, whereas I found that when I was playing these types of decks, I would get overwhelmed by the amount of redundancy there was and not really want to play options like that. So I'm interested to hear his thought process on these. Ranger Captain of Eos is like one of my favorite decks to play. Ranger Captain of Eos is with Protean Hulk strategies, because not only does it like go grab your Esper Sentinel for like those value rangers, you also get access to your sacrifice outlets, which are like super important for your deck, right? So being able to ranger, then grab a sacrifice outlet, play the sacrifice outlet, and then on your next turn, you cast your Academy Rector, I guess you sacrifice your Ranger to protect your win the next turn. So Ranger Captain can get your sack outlet and protect your win the next turn. And that combination and versatility from this card is so fantastic. Grand Abolisher, mainstay of any Protean Hulk deck. This list reminds me of like the perfect example of like what power creep over the years has become, right? So like this list, if you look at like way back to the old Carador Boon Weaver decks, right? That's what evolved into this stuff, right? the Boon Weaver Giant Reanimator stuff, that's what turned into lists like this. So it's really cool to see like the evolution of an archetype that is one of like the OG cEDH archetypes turning into this type of stuff. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, I'm a big Protean Hulk fan in general. I haven't really played Protean Hulk in a while, so it's so exciting for me to see Protean Hulk list do well. Now, you're probably seeing this right here. This was the spice of the weekend. So Scourge of Neltoth is... The idea behind it, according to Gustav, was it is an entombable sacrifice outlet that your opponents can't interact with. So say you cast a card like Buried Alive. You would put something that gets your Protean Hulk back on the battlefield. You would put Protean Hulk and you put Scourge of Neltoth in your graveyard. And then when you get your Protean Hulk back, when you reanimate it, you can use the 2 black casting costs, because Scourge of Neltoth says you can cast it from your graveyard by playing black and sacrificing 2 creatures rather than its normal mana cost. So the idea is that it's in your graveyard, and because it's part of the cost, it's kind of like an uninteractable sacrifice outlet. So you get your Protean Hulk back, and then you go, okay, now that I have priority, I'm gonna boom sacrifice my Protean Hulk and have that go off. And it's entombable, right? So like when you're going through lines with like Survival of the Fittest, right? You can do things like, okay, I'm gonna pitch away a Mana Dork, go get my Scourge of Neltoth, and then I can go pitch away the Scourge of Neltoth and get Protean Hulk, and then play my Protean Hulk onto the battlefield and go, okay, I played my Protean Hulk, and now I'm going to cast my Scourge out of the graveyard. So it's an interesting piece. I know I was talking to Gustav about it. It was really spicy because in the finals pod, he actually, the board state was locked down pretty hard because I was doing my control thing. Armix Kraum had like a Douthie out. So the board was locked pretty hard. And Gustav, under a Douthie, ended up actually tutoring for Scourge with Survival of the Fittest to hard cast it. And Tivit stopped being able to control the air for this game. Spoiler, I was playing Tivit. Stopped being able to control the air because there was another 6/6 in the battlefield, and I was like, I can't attack into Gustav. There's another 6/6 flyer. So that was a pretty spicy moment. I know in the commentary booth they kind of freaked out about it. Also, great job commentating from Drake Sasser and Mike from Playing with Power. So yeah, a fantastic job from the both of them. It was really fun to watch as I went and rewatched a bunch of the matches afterward. Yeah, and then, you know, part of being an Abzan Hulk list is you get cards like Natural Order, you get all these reanimate effects and Entomb effects, you get reanimate, persist on Markgrave, you get your Entombs in black, a slew of removal with cards like Swords and Deadly Rollick and stuff like that, Force of Vigor and Abrupt Decay. So a lot of just like solid cards and a really clean game plan. Now, going into the finals match, there were 2 undefeated players. So both in the Swiss, Gustav and I left with the same record, which was we were both 3 wins, 0 losses, and 2 draws. And then we both won our semifinals match, meaning we were both 4 wins, 0 losses, and 2 draws. So it was definitely an impressive performance. Gustav was basically one less honorable decision away from taking the whole game. He and I made a deal basically at the end of the game where I said, you know, hey, if you take care of this one thing, I can take care of another thing on my turn. But I was like, but if because he swung at me with a 3/3 and I blocked with my Drannith Magistrate, and I said, you know, if you use the Drannith Magistrate to only be a control piece and kill your opponent's board, our third player, the Armix Kraum player, I was like, I'll block with my Drannith Magistrate right now. But if you're going to just win the game, I'm not going to do it. So Gustav, being a man of his word, swung in, I blocked, and he did not go to win the game, which he could have done during that board state. And I'm interested to see what people think about that. You know, I respect the heck out of that decision. Also, it was not clear that I was able to untap and just win the game right away. But I was willing to make that decision because I trusted him as a person, and he was willing to make that decision because, you know, he also trusted me and knew I would keep my word. And it was really interesting. It was a really interesting board state. And as I said, if he was a little bit less honorable of a dude, he would have won this whole thing. So going completely undefeated, right? So definitely interesting. And now I get to talk about this. So I went 5 wins, 0 losses, and 2 ties with Tivit, Seller of Secrets. For those who've been following me on Twitter, for those who aren't following me on Twitter, I heavily suggest you start doing so, because anytime I'm in a tournament nowadays, I have been doing these like live tournament reports basically, where I will tweet out a picture of my commander and like any relevant pictures of pieces that were in the board state or during the games. And I'll say, you know, what my win-loss record is at the time. And I'll go through like what happened in the game, how I got there, or my current record if I'm losing, and go through all of those things. So if you're not following me on Twitter, just check out twitter.com/communitymtg. That is being said, yeah, I've been playing Tivit, Seller of Secrets. So this is the second weekend in a row I played this in a tournament. I played it in a local event last weekend, and I only went 2-2 with it, but it was enough to give me the victory for the local event because it was a smaller tournament. And even the games that I lost, I felt like I was in insane control over. Like, I was playing this deck because I literally picked this deck up for the first time because I really liked the interaction of Displacer Kitten and Tivit. I was like, Displacer Kitten is a card I love. I think it's really strong, and I haven't found a perfect home for it. But when you play it with Tivit, it's so busted. Let's read Tivit because there's a lot of text on this card. So it is a 6 mana Esper 6/6 with flying and ward 3. For those who don't know, ward 3 means that anytime it's targeted by a spell or ability, that spell or ability is countered unless the opponent pays 3 mana. And then whenever it enters the battlefield or deals damage, combat damage to a player, starting with me, each player votes for evidence or bribery. For each evidence, investigate, so make a clue token. For each bribery, make a treasure token. And while voting, you can vote an additional time, which is so much text, but a lot of that basically means whenever it enters the battlefield or deals combat damage, we vote on if I get clues or treasures. And there's always 5 if there's a full pot of players. If one person dies, it goes down to 4, which is, for those who have piloted this deck, and I'll go into this a little bit later, super problematic. Because if a player dies, your combos are less effective. The TLDR is that you make, usually, you will give yourself 2 treasures because your opponents will not give you 2 treasures. They will always vote for clues. Or that's always the right thing to do, is usually give them 2 treasures and then everyone else give them clues, unless there are situations that become more ambiguous as the game goes on. So like maybe you want to give me card draw later in the game because we're both behind. That's totally a thing. I've had situations where my opponents give me only treasure because they know I'm lacking card advantage, stuff like that. But then there's also points like that where like if I know I'm lacking card advantage, I'm giving myself clues instead of giving treasures. So there's a lot of like really interesting mind games that go on with Tivit triggers. But the reason to play Tivit, as I mentioned, the Displacer Kitten stuff is pretty good because your opponents are never going to give you more treasure when Displacer Kitten stuff is happening, but the fact that Displacer Kitten says every time I cast a non-creature spell, I'm at least making 2 mana and I'm making 3 clues. That's pretty good. It's pretty good. For those who know Displacer Kitten combos, I'm also playing Teferi Time Raveler. So the way that works is that if you have a mana rock that at least pays for itself, you play your Teferi Time Raveler. So for example, say I have, let's do one that just nets even, right? So let's go with, let's say Lotus Petal, because Lotus Petal can't make mana without sacrificing itself. So say I play a Lotus Petal, right? Displacer Kitten will trigger, flicker my Teferi, right? Teferi comes back in, and I say, I'm going to -3, so use Teferi's -3 here. Return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand. Draw a card. So I'm going to bounce my own Lotus Petal back to my hand, and I draw a card. Okay, I'm going to play my Lotus Petal again. Displacer Kitten's going to trigger. I'm going to flicker Teferi. We've gone through this whole loop once. The end effect is that I've drawn 1 card. Then we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again. Now, let's say I have something like a Soul Ring or a Mox Opal. Now suddenly I'm netting mana while I'm going through this loop, and I'm still drawing a card every time I go through it. Basically, the end result is that you draw your entire deck, and you have your whole deck in hand. You now have a Displacer Kitten. Every time you're playing a mana rock, you can flicker another mana rock, so you're generating just like a buttload of mana, and you usually, it's really hard to not win the game when that's going on. Teferi is also really impressive because it's a combo piece, but it's also a silence, right? The amount of games I've won in this deck because I've been able to defend Teferi specifically, or my opponents only have like instants and sorcery counters or counters for smaller things, and I'll play Teferi, and they'll be in a position where they can't really fight over it too hard. And then when it goes back to my turn, or hopefully I don't have to pass with Teferi up, that's like the nightmare scenario, but the ideal scenario is that you play it like a Grand Abolisher where it just comes down and says, you cannot interact anymore with what I'm doing. And then you start doing your combo, and eventually it protects itself, basically, is the idea of it. Teferi is also cool because it protects my other combos in the deck, right? So I can play Teferi and then resolve a Thassa's Oracle and go for Demonic Consultation. I'm also on those lines in this deck specifically. One spicy include that I never saw, sadly enough, is Urza, Lord High Artificer. The idea is that a lot of the time, if your opponents are smart, in the situation that I mentioned before, they will flood you out with clues. So you'll be out of treasures, but you'll have like 9 clues in the battlefield. So that's pretty frequent. And then you play your Urza and you go, okay, now my clues are suddenly tapping for mana, tapping for a blue mana for each of them. And clues actually don't need to tap to sacrifice and draw cards. So now your clues are paying for themselves, basically, or at least 1 mana of its own sacrifice cost. And once again, you have this, you turn your treasures into always being able to tap for blue, or, you know, sack to tap for any other color. So Urza plus Tivit really gets out of control. Plus the construct, as I mentioned, it's very easy to make an insane amount of clues and things like that with your commander Tivit. So having Urza out and then making this construct that's like just like a 15-15 beating people to death is like a realistic thing to happen. Maybe 15-15 is too much, but like a 7-7 on top of the fact that you have Tivit, a flying 6-6, that starts to end games real quick. If you notice here in my creature base, I have like all the Esper good creatures, right? Like you have your Esper Sentinel for card advantage, Ogma for card advantage, Douthie for card advantage and being a hate bear, Drannith Magistrate, probably one of the best hate bears for commander of all time. You have Grand Abolisher, which protects your win cons, Phantasmal Image, which makes, you know, losing to a Dockside a lot less painful. You can just like copy a Dockside later on. You have your opposition agents to really hate on what your opponent's trying to do. You have Notion Thief because there are hands that exist in this deck where you want to like dump out some early mana rocks and cast a Windfall or a Time Twister. That's definitely a thing. The more I've played the deck, definitely is less like unlikely for me to go for those options, but it's also just like still one of the best hate bearers of all time, because you just stop your opponents like steamrolling out of control with some of these card advantage engines, right? So you're playing against like a Tymna Kraum. During the Swiss, I was playing against a Tymna deck, and they were like starting to slowly edge away with the game, and I just flashed in this Notion Thief and said like, no, we're all going to be at parity for a little bit. Or in the finals round, the round that I ended up winning for the whole thing, my Armix Kraum opponent flashed in a Notion Thief, and like the impact of that card alone stopped it from being like, oh, Tivit's running away from the game, or oh, Protean Hulk's running away from the game. And there was a lot more like back and forth table talk because there was this Notion Thief stopping people from drawing. It was, yeah, the card's just really impactful, and especially in a deck like this, which is considerably more mid-range. In a deck like this, it's very strong. Let me go through the combos of Tivit. So we've gone through the Teferi and Displacer Kitten. We have our Thrasios Oracle and our Demonic Consultation / Tainted Pact, classic win cons there. And then the other one, which is like the Tivit win con, is a fun little artifact right down here called Time Sieve. So what Time Sieve says is you sacrifice 5 artifacts and you take an extra turn after this one. Well, if you remember correctly, Tivit, when it enters the battlefield or attacks, makes 5 artifacts in a pod of 4 players. And a pod of 4 players is very important, and it has come up a good amount. But you have this 1-card combo with your commander, and it's a 1-card combo that like does pretty decent against removal. So for example, I've had situations come up at least 3 or 4 times now where like I'll resolve the Time Sieve, and then someone will like cast a Nature's Claim after I go to take another turn, but I've already sacrificed the thing, the 5 artifacts, and it's like, okay, like you stopped it going infinite, but it was a 2-mana Time Warp that said sacrifice a couple clues and treasures. That's awesome. And once again, if it works, it's just straight up blue-black. If you have your commander on the battlefield, you win the game. That's insane. And the amount of Tivit math I've had to do, because I've been in multiple 3-player pods with this deck, whether A, being at a local event and it starting as a 3-player pod, which was tough, or being in pods like the finals match where our Rog Silas opponent just went so hard into Necropotence and immediately got punished and died super early in the game. And then it was just 3 players. And the amount of times I could like 1-card tutor for a Time Sieve and not do anything with it were a lot. But there's also ways to play around that. And I get that question a lot in this deck. First of all, we already have a completely separate set of win conditions. Once again, Thrasios Oracle and the Displacer Kitten combos, right? But the Time Sieve thing is absolutely attainable in a finite way. I actually think I won round 3, I want to say, of this tournament by going, I had like 9 clues and like a Mox Opal and a Soul Ring. And it was just like a natural progression of things. Maybe 9. No, yeah, I think it was 9 clues. So this was after I had attacked for that turn. But I was able to play Time Sieve and go, okay, I'm going to sacrifice 5 of these. Next turn, I'm going to hit you and make 4. So all I really needed to do was have the ability to get down to 1. So I would go down 1 artifact every single time I went through the loop, but I was able to take a finite amount of turns and a finite enough amount of turns that I was able to kill my opponents, because it didn't matter that I couldn't like go infinite per se, because like 10 extra turns, turns out, is still going to win you the game. So that was the big thing there. Things you want to look out for if you're piloting this deck: if your opponents have flying blockers, you have to come up with a game plan about how you're going to do that. One of the cool things about Tivit is the Ward 3. I think Ward 3 is huge on this card. Is one of the main reasons that I went from being like, oh, Tivit's a cool card, to like, oh, I'm actually going to go sleeve up that deck and play my own version of it. Because the fact that Ward 3 makes it so that your opponents actually have to invest a lot of resources that they do not want to invest into taking it. I've only had it Gilded Drake once, and that person was definitely willing to pay 5 mana for it. I have had it like hard removed. I want to say there's been enough 4 mana Swords to Plowshares to make my life inconvenient for sure. But like your opponents who are only playing bounce removal, they'll never remove this card. Like no one wants to pay 5 mana to Alchemist Retrieval this card only for me to play it next turn and still have the enter the battlefield trigger. That just doesn't happen. And one cool part about Tivit is that you tend to net enough mana while you're going through the deck that you actually just straight up can recast Tivit for 8 or 10 or 12. And I've done it. I've done it several times now, where you just like, yeah, this commander is inherently very expensive, but I can recast it again. Obviously, the biggest problem for this deck is Dockside Extortionist. Not in the way that like, oh, you just auto lose Dockside Extortionist, or the same with like, I guess, Collector Roof, but just to know that like these are definitely problems. I'm on 30 lands, which I know is a little more than most people play in cEDH right now, and that's helped a lot with like the whole Collector Roof problem, because I actually straight up just make my land drops and play fair magic a little bit. That definitely has like helped mitigate that. And as far as like the dockside thing is, you're playing enough of a control deck to not really have to worry about that. Like, yes, they'll make a ton of mana, but you're still making a bunch of mana with Tivit. If you already have a bunch of clues and things and treasures on the battlefield, it's because you've been investing in your card advantage and you've been acquiring a lot of resources. So despite that, like feeding a dockside pretty hard, it also means that you're, you know, at least still being responsible and you have a bunch of resources at the moment, or you should at least. So let's talk about this build of Tivit specifically. First of all, I want to thank Zane, or Z-Rob on the internet, who is one of the Eminence folks and was the person whose initial Tivit template I used to build this deck. So the initial foundation of this deck, I think we have a considerable amount of differences at this point, but definitely the initial like skeleton of this deck was thanks to Zane. And so when I initially built this deck, I was like, oh, the whole point out is that you turbo out Tivit, because that's how I saw someone at my local event like play is they turboed out Tivit. And then when I was playing it with like people in like local games and like pickup games, I was like, oh, that's so weird. Like there are some games where I turbo out Tivit and like that doesn't even work sometimes, and I'm not as fast as a turbo ad nauseum deck, and sometimes you turbo out Tivit, and then you're like, what else do I do now? And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, the deck's not doing the thing correctly. And I was like, what is the deck actually trying to do? So what I realized is you're playing Esper, right? So you have access to white. So you have cards like Drannith Magistrate, and you have cards like Doughty Voidwalker, which really, in Opposition Agent, Notion Thief, these cards cripple your opponents. They genuinely do. And Tivit being a 6/6 flyer is definitely impactful. That's not quite it, though. The Esper Sentinel and Archivist Vogma coming down early and providing you with a ridiculous amount of card advantage is a real thing. So I had several games where either turn 1 Esper Sentinel, Mana Rock, and or Mystic Remora was the other one, and I would play like 1 Mana Rock and hold up a counter spell, and that was like so enough. Esper Sentinel still continuing to be, my opinion, for the most underrated card at the moment. I think this card's insane, and I think a lot of people know this card's insane, and I still think it's underrated. This card has won me single-handedly so many games in my span playing this format, and since it's been printed. Like, it is by far the card lately that has won me the most games. Throwing that one out there so you all know. But for like a mid-range deck like this, you just play it early and you accrue card advantage, or you play your early Remora, or you get your turn 1 Rhystic Study, which I didn't even do that often, but like turn 1 Esper Sentinel has been more than enough for me in multiple games with this deck. And you're like, well, your commander's 6 mana, how are you going to pay off the turn 1? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You get there eventually. The game, you play your card advantage engines and you acquire some resources, you hold up some counter spells, you play some stacks pieces at the right time, and then you eventually play Tivit. And when you eventually play Tivit, now your engine is starting to keep up with the broken decks in the format. Sometimes you also get a turn 2 Tivit, right? And that's the nut hand, but I don't want to talk about those. Those aren't the helpful hands that are going to help you learn from this deck. And I realize that this video is starting to turn into just a full Tivit deck, but that's okay. So you play like a mid-range deck, right? Like you play your early Dranniths to shut down your opponents. You play your early Esper Sentinels to provide you your card advantage. And then you get a lot of really insane mid-range pieces. Dam and Toxic Deluge are awesome to break parity on, because Deluge specifically in this deck is so good, because there are very few creatures you really care about keeping around. And in desperate scenarios, like, you're like, I'm going to wipe the board. And even if you're playing against a deck like Winota, where like you have to go all the way up to X=4, you're like, yeah, I will happily play Tivit and then use the treasures from Tivit to cast a Toxic Deluge. This is a real example. To cast a Toxic Deluge for X=5 and have my Tivit stick around and have literally no one else have a board. And it was awesome. It was a great, great moment in this deck. And that stuff happens a lot. Obviously with Dam, you don't get the same luxury, but Dam, once again, being a single target removal piece that you have the flexibility to make it, has meant that I have done something similar to Dam, where it's like, oh, I could wipe the board here, but I'll kill my own Tivit. I'll still do it, or I'll be like, oh, I guess instead I'll use it as a single target removal piece. So Dam's been great, as I said, this like mid-rangey deck. Savine's Reclamation is a card I really want to talk about, because first of all, people keep asking me if there's an intuition pile. There's not. There's no intuition in this deck, but there's Savine's Reclamation, because turns out when you have a 1-card win condition that just wins the game with your commander, that card's really good. And people will counter it. This card existing in the deck, Savine's existing in the deck, meant that I could be way more aggressive when I'm trying to win than other decks and other options in this format. So the ability to, and this play pattern happened Oh man, I don't even know how many times. But Savines, I was originally playing a Rest in Peace version of this deck, and I cut Rest in Peace and I put in Savines, and best decision I've made for as far as like brewing Tivit. But being able to go, okay, I'm going to cast Time Sieve, and your opponents stop it, and you're like, okay, I'm going to pass the turn, right? Because usually you play Tivit and play Time Sieve, or something like that, where you have to like play Time Sieve early, where you don't have a ton of resources, or you're fighting over it, and you exhaust your opponents out of counter magic, and then you go, okay, another real example from the day. Okay, end step, I'm going to Vampiric Tutor. All right, untap, have a ton of mana because I already have Tivit. I'm going to hit someone with Tivit, get a bunch more mana. All right, I'm going to try and Savine's Reclamation back my Time Sieve. I'm probably going to defend it once, maybe with a counter spell. Okay, didn't work. All right, I'm going to flashback Savine's Reclamation targeting Time Sieve. And by that point, your opponents are like, I can't do this anymore. They can't play this game anymore. And you get there. Yeah, Savine's Reclamation in a permanent win condition having deck is so good. It's like legitimately making me rethink it in Dawnwake or Thrasios. Because my leaning with that deck has always been like, okay, I would just rather play Rest in Peace. But the same mentality for this list and the same performance of this card from this list is making me like completely rethink my utilization of this card in decks with permanence as win cons that can be hit with this card. Yeah, this card was by far the MVP of the tournament. It was probably the MVP of the tournament I had beforehand. Savine's Rec puts in a ton of work with Time Sieve specifically, but also being able to steal positions where you like Savine's back your Grand Abolisher is so good. Because for example, there's like so say your Grand Abolisher gets removed or your Teferi gets tacked down. There's going to be situations where that happens, and then you have to like try and Displacer Kitten combo off into a Heuristic Study. Well, being able to Savine's back your Grand Abolisher or your Teferi, and once again, these are all real examples I'm coming up with here, to not feed the Heuristic Study so much, so like one or two spells feeding it, as opposed to trying and a combo that involves you casting spells over and over and over and over again. It just means that like you have so many layered options here to make sure you go off when you want to go off. Grand Abolisher obviously does the thing insanely well. I don't really have to go off on that card, but like there are discussions on the best colors in Magic right now, and I've been kind of memeing after I guess the entire day I was playing this tournament that Esper was better than Grixis, but one of my actual legitimate arguments for that point, most of it's a meme, as I've said, but like one of my legitimate arguments is the fact that you have this nearly impossible to interact with silence package, where you have like silence itself, you have Grand Abolisher, which the amount of times I've seen Grand Abolisher just steal games where opponents have like Dispel, Flusterstorm, Fierce Guardianship in hand, or like any sort of combo deck is just it innumerable. And so the Grand Abolisher Teferi pairing on top of the fact that you also have silence and other things like that just means that there's so many free wins you can have right now just by having white as the support color to your deck. I don't think white is like the best color on its own, but as a support color, it's really hard to imagine a better color. White is very, very strong. I mean, blue obviously is like blue and black are really good, right? So that's kind of what I've gotten on Esper, right? So you have your asymmetrical stacks pieces, you have your asymmetrical silence effects, and you have your black tutors, which are insane in the deck. You get everything you want when you need it, and then you have blue for your card advantage and counter spells. And like Esper is just really, really well positioned right now. And there's a lot of people who will argue that like Dockside and Underworld Breach and speed is better, but for me personally, as more of a mid-range player and a stacks player, traditionally speaking, I'm leaning towards Esper for my decks right now. And let's just go over some includes that are worth noting. So Urza, as I mentioned earlier, just really good late game payoff. I still haven't seen it in a game. I haven't seen it happen once. So I hope it's good. I'm playing Time Twister and Windfall, even though this is, as I mentioned, a mid-range deck. There are opportunities with like Notion Thief, and you're already kind of wanting to play Smothering Tithe in this deck. So those two includes kind of seem free, and then they open up the possibilities of like really early mana dump hands into a wheel. Another MVP of this deck has been Counterbalance. Counterbalance is so good. It won me many, many games. It won me games where my opponents had silenced the table and were able to defend the silence, but they couldn't go off because there was like a 2-drop on top of my deck. Counterbalance is so good. And the fact that with Tivit, you have your mana up and your clues up, and you're able to do crazy stuff like, so I have Sensei's Top in here. I'm probably going to cut that. But in general with Tivit, if you like, someone else triggers your Counterbalance and you're like, okay, I'm going to flip on this card, and okay, it's 1-drop on top, but I need a 2-drop. All right, so I'm going to use my treasures to crack a clue from Tivit to draw that card and hopefully reset the top of my deck. And then if the card you draw happens to also be a counterspell, which I had come up twice during the tournament where I flipped over a Pact of Negation with my counterbalance, and my opponent had like a 2-drop or something, and I was like, okay, well, either way, I'm going to crack the clue, reset the top of my deck in case they cast another spell, and cast the Pact of Negation for free. So the Tivit plus counterbalance interaction was awesome. Big fan of that card. It put in a ton of work here. Nothing else really worth noting in the sorcery section. The instants, there's a lot of interaction. You're going to notice a ton of interaction in this deck. Bunch of counter spells, some targeted removal, some silences. March of Swirling Mist put in a ton of work. Cyclonic Rift is a card I'm never leaving home without. Muddle is super cute in here because it's a counter spell that you're happy to play and also transmutes for your time sieve. Play Mana Drain because you have a 6-mana commander. I did live the dream of playing a Tivit Mirror and mana draining their Tivit so that on my turn I could cast my Tivit, which was just a chef's kiss, like so good. I am on Ad Nauseam. It may get cut, I know, which is heresy to some people, but this is not a main phase Ad Naus deck. And I have had an opportunity to tutor this card multiple times during games I've played, and it's never felt appropriate to do so. So that to me is indicative that I could use the slot for something that I'm much happier to get in the early, mid, or late game. Whereas I've had this come up in the early game, I've had it come up in the mid game, had it come up in the late game, and I'm never really excited to cast Ad Naus. Now, I haven't had a lot of opportunities where I'm like really behind and then can end step Naus. I haven't had that really come up a bunch. But I've also once again noticed that I'm really never actively looking for this card. So it's staying in for now, but it is definitely something I have to think about. And, you know, it hasn't put in the work yet. That doesn't mean that I've played 1,000 games with this deck and isn't worth the include. It just means that as of right now, I've been underimpressed comparatively to how it is with a lot of other decks in the format. And once again, I'm fine with end step 5 mana, draw 10 cards with this card. I don't need it to be the best Ad Nauseam deck. Even so, our curve is actually pretty crazy. Yeah, our Ad Nauseam curve is 1.23, but it's just not set up because, as I mentioned, it's more of mid-range decks. We have these like proactive stacks pieces. We don't have our Underworld Breaches. It's not really set up to be a main phase Nas deck, but it's definitely a deck that can easily end step an Ad Nauseam, even though I have yet to do so. Artifact inclusions worth noting, as I mentioned, Sensei's Top is probably the first card to go, if I'm being honest. I have had it on the field multiple times and have never wanted to play it or use it really, because Tivit's just giving you mana and clues, so you don't really need Sensei's Top. You don't need that card advantage, and then Esper Colors is giving you a ton of card advantage in general, so it's not really doing much. So it's probably gonna go. I don't know what I'm cutting it for yet, so I'm not gonna suggest anything. This deck breaks parity on Digger's Cage. The only card that really is affected by it is you cannot flash back Savine's Reclamation while Diggers is on the battlefield. But compared to the stuff that your opponents are doing, like, first of all, you can still cast to the first part of Savine's Reclamation, targeting your time sieve, or targeting Teferi, but you can't do a creature. Savine's Reclamation still gets to be used while Diggers is out on time sieve specifically, which is like the main target for it, or Teferi, which is like the secondary target for it. And despite it shutting down a few things in our deck, the amount of things it shuts down from our opponents, green decks specifically, like get your Finale of Devastation out of here, no Green Sun Zenith, no Neoform, no Eldritch Evolution, which my opponents have punted into so many times with Digger's Cage on the battlefield. So very much like worth it in this list for sure. And then Curse Totem, because the only activated ability of a creature in the deck is Douthie Voidwalker, which, oh no, it's only a one-sided rest in peace if its creature ability is shut down. I guess Urza as well. That's definitely a thing for sure. But I still think having the construct is worth it for Urza and Curse Totem. And I'm still happy to do it because the amount of things like Thrasios and Glinthorn Buccaneer combos and all of those things, I'm happy to have a little bit of asymmetrical stacks with Curse Totem and Digger's Cage in here. And the amount of work that they put in during the tournament and in general, super worth it. Absolutely worth it. Enchantments, we've already kind of gone over thing. Mystic Ristic, auto-include, counterbalance, super busted in this deck, and Smothering Tide feels like an auto-include. Cavernous Souls in here because Rogue is a really cool type to name. So Tivit is a Sphinx Rogue, which is super cool because an uncounterable Tivit makes you feel so good and so safe inside. But we have Douthie Voidwalker as another rogue in the deck. We have Opposition Agent as another rogue in the deck. And we have Notion Thief as another rogue in the deck. So, you know, 4 very potent targets for Cavern of Souls, and I haven't really had any situations in the past 2 events I took this tech to where it didn't come up. So it's pretty cool. So yeah, I know this video ended up being a lot about my deck, but I guess it's the one I'm definitely the most experienced with, and it's definitely, I would say, one of the spicier includes in this top four. And I'm just so grateful to have been presented with the opportunity to perform so well in this tournament. I went 5 wins, 0 losses, and 2 draws the day, so didn't lose a single game with this deck. And as a longtime cEDH tournament grinder, it feels good to finally take home a big win. The only win I had before this was the MLC, and I don't really consider that a tournament. It's more of a league. So this has been my first real tournament victory, first real tournament first place finish. I've had top 4s in the past, many top 16 performances in the past, top 13 performances, but this is my first win. And I'm really proud to have done it on this deck that I, put a decent amount of work into, but with a lot of the ideas that I had to challenge some aspects of the format really paying off really well. And it was the first deck I've played in a long time where it felt like I was able to fully utilize my skill set and the deck would pay me off for it. And that's one thing I really enjoy about this list specifically. It felt like, when people describe like weapons masters back in the day, they feel like they have an extension of their body when they have their weapon in their hand. And that's what Tivit feels like to me. It feels like a true extension of the way I like playing Magic. It feels like the deck is so synergistic with exactly what I'm trying to do, utilizes the things that I find in my skill set really well. And because of that, the deck performed very, very well, and I'm very happy with it. And so grateful to have, taken first place in this tournament. Huge shout out to my other top 4 competitors, especially Gustav, who, as I said, kept his word and could have scummed me out there at the end to steal the victory, and appreciate that he didn't do that. And also having an amazing performance going, 3 wins, 0 losses, or sorry, 4 wins, 0 losses, and 2 draws before this final match. So having an insane record and, one moment in this tournament, or one bad draw, one decision, and this would be a completely different conversation. The fact that I'd be talking about how Gustav went undefeated in this tournament, right? So huge shout out to him specifically, but big shout out to the rest of my top 4 competitors and everyone there. Congrats on Eminence for running their first Playing with Power event, which is pretty cool. But yeah, this was an awesome tournament. Thank you to Playing with Power for putting this tournament on. Thank you for Eminence Gaming for being the people running this tournament. And I am so grateful to be here in this top 4. And thank you all for watching this video. If you like videos like this, if you want to hear more about these tournaments, please make sure to hit like and subscribe so I can give you all the tournament details you are looking for. And if you want to be some of the reasons that I'm able to go out and pursue these tournaments and compete at the highest level, make sure to check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. My patrons are the reason that I can do this week after week, and are the reasons that I'm able to give you these firsthand tournament reports and allow me to continue making videos for you guys. So thank you so much to my patrons. You're always super appreciated, and I couldn't do it without you. I would love to hear everybody's reactions this top 4. Love to hear people's opinions on the color pie breakdown. What are the best colors in the format right now? What do you think you would have taken to this tournament? There's actually a full document released right now of every single deck that was in this tournament by the Playing with Power, and we might do a breakdown of that on this channel. Some other things that are coming up: I'm going to be a featured guest at Oktoberfest this coming November, which is the new Monarch Media event, and it's super exciting. I can't wait to share live updates from things like that from that tournament, and I'm going to be talking more detail as things goes on. There's also the MTG Summit coming up, which I will be a featured guest at, and you can find me in their command zone. It's going to be like 3 days of just like no tournaments, but just playing Magic with really cool people. Like, the guest list is insane, and I'm super excited to be able to attend that. And thank you to the Summit for allowing me to be a featured guest there, and thank you to Oktober for allowing me to be a featured guest there. And when it comes to next year, early 2023, Eminence Gaming, the people who ran this event for Playing with Power, the people who ran Punt City and their premiere event, they're doing an event in San Jose called Silicon Dynasty, which I will also be attending, and I'll probably be making a video on coming pretty soon. So many things in the works. Thank you all for watching. It's super appreciated. Thank you very much, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving.